I used to think that adding more and more contrast and saturation to my landscape photos was how to make them pop. The thing is, sometimes it worked, but half the time it looked overcooked and crushed all sense of depth in a scene. Until I discovered one thing. So in this video, I'm showing you what actually makes a landscape photo pop, a Photoshop trick to boost saturation and make a photo stand out without overcooking it, and I'll show you a hidden Photoshop feature that enhances depth instead of destroying it. But first, it's important to understand this fundamental rule that contributes to depth in a landscape scene, because when you create or enhance depth, that's when a landscape feels less flat and is really going to pop. I can demonstrate it using this photo, which is the unedited raw file loaded straight into Photoshop. So using Photoshop's color picker, I'm going to sample the colors in the tree in the foreground, and we can see the saturation value is hovering around the 50 to 60% kind of ballpark. And if I do the same over these trees off in the distance, which are the same trees pretty much under the same warm early morning sun, the saturation values drop down to around 30-something%. So this is evidence of something called atmospheric perspective, which is the effect air particles have on how far away things look. When there's a lot of it happening, you'd normally call it haze. And the thing about haze is that even Adobe kind of make it out to be a bad thing, because they literally put a slider in Lightroom to remove it. It's called dehaze, or in other words, increase saturation and contrast to nuclear levels. Now there might be situations where you want to do that, but for most landscapes, why remove something that makes an image more three-dimensional? I don't know. But knowing all of this, how could you now adjust the saturation in this scene in a way that would enhance the perception of depth? Well, one way would be to increase saturation, but only in the stuff that's closer to the camera, which is already the more saturated stuff because of the atmospheric perspective or haze in the distance. So what we want to do is basically, well, think of it as the opposite of what Photoshop and Lightroom's vibrance sliders do, which is boost saturation in the less saturated areas. So it's a bit counterintuitive, I know, but there's no slider to only boost the more saturated stuff. So how do you do it? First, saturation isn't the only way to enhance or destroy depth. Light, contrast, and color all behave differently depending on distance. So you have to treat them differently when making adjustments in the foreground compared to a background. Now, I have no idea why Adobe haven't put it front and center in Photoshop, but there's a hidden feature that makes it easy to create something called a depth mask, which lets you apply adjustments selectively in the foreground and background independently. I'll show you how to create a depth mask next, but in the meantime, if you want to download a Photoshop action I made that does it for you, then just click a link in the description or pinned comment below. So that's a depth mask. Now here's how you can create what's called a saturation mask, so we can give these already saturated trees a little bit more pop. First, we'll add a selective color adjustment layer, and then in its properties, we'll go through each of these colors in this drop-down menu and slide the black slider to -100. So that's the reds, the yellows, the greens, cyans, blues, magentas, all go to -100. And then the white slider, that goes to +100. The neutrals, +100, and finally the blacks, again +100. And then finally just make sure this toggle is set to absolute. And the result is this kind of weird looking black and white version of your photo, where the lighter areas in this black and white view are the more saturated areas of the original, and the darker areas are where saturation is lower. And that all confirms the eyedropper saturation values that we looked at a minute ago, where the trees in the foreground are lighter and therefore more saturated in the original than those same trees off in the distance. Okay, so this is great information, but how can we actually use it? First, what you'll do is go to the channels panel, and then while holding Control on the keyboard on PC or Command on a Mac, click on the RGB channel thumbnail. Then come back over to the layers panel, add a hue saturation adjustment layer from down here. Technically can be any adjustment layer you like, but we're using it to boost the saturation, so we'll use hue saturation adjustment layer. And when we do that, if you look at the layer mask on this adjustment layer now, you can see that it has this black and white version of the image loaded directly into it. And that is your saturation mask. Or in other words, this adjustment will now affect the more saturated areas of the image more than it will the less saturated areas. When I increase the saturation, hiding this layer first, we don't need that anymore, you can see that the trees and the grass in the foreground are affected more than the stuff off in the distance. And what this means is that we've enhanced the image's apparent depth by exaggerating the existing natural atmospheric perspective. And a saturation mask works great for an image like this where you have the same objects, i.e. trees, in the foreground and background. But what if things in the distance are naturally more saturated than things in the foreground because they're just different things? It's not going to work then. So that is when depth masks come into the picture. So watch this next video to discover a hidden Photoshop feature that creates a depth mask based on Photoshop analyzing the actual distance of things in your scene so you can adjust them selectively based on that distance.